I will learn to count to 3 one of these days. Like
it's the counting backwards part that's challenging for you, right?
And it's with the fingers. It's like I have to watch myself so I don't do like the Mr. Rogers thing where he does like tall man and flipped everybody off in the audience. So how are you, Andrew?
I am doing great. So, wow, it's I don't know how it is up there in Maryland way, but it is rainy today. So, in addition to having the okay, wait, this is going to be way too distracting. I've got to mute. Sorry, I'm watching our streaming video and I got the audio in my ear, so that's probably not going to be helpful. So I muted that.
Yeah, I've been there. Not so good.
So, raining like crazy here. Pretty busy. Actually just got an update. Yes, English is my first language. An update for my Lumia 920. So delighted to say that I've got the GDR2 and Amber updates. So I'm looking forward to playing around with the Nokia Pro Camera app.
Cool.
That's gonna be a lot of fun. So some very cool geeky stuff already just to start things off. I see from the background there that you've rearranged your entire office.
I have. I've moved a bunch of stuff around here just to make it more likely that I'm going to play with the things over here, and to make it so that most of my equipment is now patched in a way that I can play it or hear it. I was having a problem before where I had to constantly swap stuff in and out if I wanted to mess around with it, and any friction makes it unlikely for you to actually use stuff, or at least in my case.
Yeah. No, I agree. I've got my my audio rig downstairs, which I wasn't prepared to carry upstairs for this show. I actually bought a patch bay for all of my audio equipment because I've got like the digital recorder. I think I might have mentioned this Zoom recorder. I've got my digital piano and a bunch of other stuff, and it's just a lot easier to have that set up with I've got the 1/4-inch patch bay. And so having all that gear just plugged into the back of that, and then I can just route whatever I want to whatever I want very quickly. I agree with you. It makes it a whole lot more likely that, instead of it just stagnating, you can just go down and, I want to rock out on the synth today, or I want to play with, the DAW software. Let me just plug the PC into the monitors and boom, I'm done.
So you said you have one of the Zoom recorders?
I do. It's the R24. It's an 8. It's got 8 inputs, both 1/4-inch and XLR. So it's basically 8 sliders and 8 inputs. It's got 24 overall channels that you can record to. So basically, you can set it up with, you can kind of swap between 3 banks of 8 to set up the channels. So you can kind of bounce to different channels and whatnot. Has like basically a basic rhythm kit built into it, so you can do rhythm patterns. Sampler, including so 8 pads underneath the sliders, so you can actually record a loop and trigger it based on the pads. I mean, it's so much more powerful than what I'm competent to use. It's not even funny. But one of the reasons I bought it is that the unit itself runs on batteries, and it has 2 onboard condenser mics. So I can basically grab that, run it on battery, and I sing in a Schola group. They do Latin chant. And so taking it for rehearsals, I could just drop it on the piano, press record, and record the whole thing, and then just yank out the SD card, and upload it to SkyDrive to share with the rest of the guys. So it's really easy to.
That would actually
do
make for some awesome
like
samples too. So
yeah, actually, that's a good idea. I like that.
I had thought about getting one of the portable recorders, but more for like going out and sampling things for kind of found sounds, right? But then I keep going back and forth between, do I want to do that, or do I want to get a good microphone that I hook into either my Surface or my phone or something and do it that way? So I'm still torn.
I say, why not both?
Yeah. That's a good.
As many toys as you have, what's one more?
Excuse me, you wouldn't believe it from looking around here, but I am actually discerning for the most part on what I get. But hey, so last week we didn't have the show. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, so the other cool thing about the Zoom is that a lot of the portable recorders, like Hanselman uses one that's just like a size of a small paperback, right? And those are fine, but you only have a couple of inputs on that. The cool thing about the Zoom is it's 8 inputs, but it's basically about the size of a laptop. So I can throw that. So I can throw that recorder, a couple of tabletop mic stands, a couple of SM58s and mic cables into a laptop bag and throw it over my shoulder and have a great podcast rig too. So as a portable podcast rig, it's pretty unbeatable.
Yeah. So last week we had no show because I was, you were there.
Because
I spent about 2 hours swearing at Wirecast, right? It was just, because Pete. So just the number of technical difficulties with that was, whenever you get more than one thing wrong, right, it's really hard to debug because you've increased the amount of complexity there. So I'm sure there's a formula for figuring that out, but it's quite a bit. And the main problem was I had gone on campus and had my laptop in use up there, and then when I brought it back, it forgot that my home network was a trusted network, right? And the place where you change that changed in Windows 8.1, it's not in the same spot as it was in Windows 8. And I just never had to change it in 8.1. And so for some reason, the desktop presenter software that comes with Wirecast will not stream unless, discovering and sharing is on, despite the fact that it only uses IP addresses. So I have no idea why that was the case, but shortly after you and I just said, forget it, it's been like 2 and a half, whatever it was, hours messing with this, I was able to get that machine set up as a local network, got that fixed, and then I was able to debug the second problem that was going on with Wirecast where it was forgetting some other settings and stuff. So there was a bit of a cluster.
Right.
But it appears we're working today. And for all like 3 or however many of you that are watching this live, thank you. I hope it's working fine for you. The other thing is the week before that, I was up on campus, as I said, and I was there for both the company meeting, which was pretty cool. I'd never been to one before, but also the Decibel conference.
Okay. All right. Well, so what's Decibel?
So Decibel is why, thank you, Andrew. Decibel is basically a music conference or a music event. It's not a conference with like thousands of people walking around with name tags in a big hall, but it basically takes over Seattle, all the clubs in Seattle, and Windows had a presence in the registration area where we had DJ equipment set up with Surface Pros, and then also with the Acer S. It's not the one like I got my wife, but it's the one with the funky top to it where the touchpad is actually behind the keyboard and the full touch screen. So we had those set up, and we had Surface Pros set up with DJ equipment from Behringer, and people could come in and just play with that while they were waiting to register. So that was very cool. Tons of fun. This time I wussed out and I didn't go to any of the music or anything that night, which I know killed the guy that set it up. He was like, "What? You're not going to go?" But I had had enough that day.
A little fried.
Yeah, and when you're so close to campus, you feel like you need to go back and work, right?
Yeah.
And so that's different from...
So wait, listening to music isn't work?
It can be. I'm working on that. So it's different from Mutech, which we did in Montreal in May, because that was up in Montreal. First of all, it's Montreal. If you haven't been to Montreal since, for years, it's really a fun place. The arts there are really, really strong, which is a really fun thing. But Windows had a lounge there, sort of same thing. We didn't have DJ equipment out, but we had Surfaces and stuff out. All the registration was done on Surface. People would take your picture for your badge on the Surface and everything like that. And we had DJs coming and performing in that lounge, and we had a bar that it was just like a ticket bar or something like that. But really tons of fun there as well.
Now, as I recall, you had pictures from both shows in your Twitter feed, right?
Yeah, so I should
if they either go out to your Twitter feed and look at the pictures, or I think you also had some up on SkyDrive.
Yeah, I think I'll just repost links to those because I'm rather prolific on Twitter, so it might be hard to dig those up. But yeah, I'll post those because it was really cool. We had people there who came in and said, "Oh, I didn't know you could DJ on Windows." Right?
Yeah.
Which I'm just like, yeah, it's what I've been using forever and ever. But the music scene is so dominated by Apple products at this point that folks just didn't realize that, hey, wow, touchscreen's really cool and stuff. So, yeah. And this is getting suspiciously sounding like work, but that's where I was, the week before, which was very, very cool.
Now, Decibel,
it fits in with the topic for today.
Right now, Decibel, did you guys have the music? What are we calling this? The blade.
So the music cover and the remix app. Those were not there at Decibel. It's too soon between that.
Yeah.
Still very cool stuff though. We're working.
But those are out in the hands of some of the premier folks in the industry, right? I mean, I know there was a promo video from the guy from Lincoln Park. Was it?
Yes.
Is that right?
And he performed at the company meeting. Steve went to Steve Aito or something like that. So he got up and did some jamming on the cover, which was really cool. And obviously there's been a lot of interest about that cover. It's not in the wild yet so much. I think a few people have been able to see it, but I'm not sure that anybody has it long term yet. But that'll be soon.
Okay.
Right.
It's pretty exciting.
Actually, yeah. So today's topic is building, or not to say building, but basically how to make music these days, primarily on a computer, right? And you got a new toy, which I think we want to show off a little bit. Actually, let's hear your new toy for a second.
So actually, before we jump into the new toy, I wanted to kind of show off an old toy because I think the two toys are by the same manufacturer, and they hit different ends of the spectrum in terms of the kind of musician that they appeal to. Yep. The old one is actually something that I bought probably, maybe even like 4 years ago. So this little box is a synthesizer. So this is made by a company called
Korg.
It's a Korg K oscillator. They actually have a newer version of this out that's about half the size and actually has more features, but I'm too cheap to replace something that already works with something that's a little different. But I'm going to turn on my volume here. So basically, this is what they call a phrase synthesizer. So you can actually just noodle around on this, and it's got a scroll wheel that goes through different groups of synthesizer patches. So they've got leads, bass parts, drum patterns, and individual drum things. So you can basically just record loops and layer after layer after layer of loops. And actually, while I'm explaining this, can you go ahead and hit up my devhammer.net website and go to the music page? Because I've got, there's a song I did on this called DevHammer's Chaos. And if you can get the audio from that would kind of demonstrate some of what you're able to do with this. But you get some interesting lead sounds. My favorite though is just the drum patterns. So I can turn on a pattern and just kind of get a good drum rhythm going. And then you get a fill just by touching elsewhere on the pad.
Yep. Right?
So you get the drum pattern, and then you can go in and there's just a simple button. The interface is super simple. There's like 3 buttons, the wheel. So I can start my drum pattern, but I want to record it. So I just hit, and then it just keeps looping, right?
Yep.
So I'm not touching anything, but the drum pattern's looping. And then I can come in and grab a lead sound, and I can go and grab what they call a gate arpeggiator. And so I can select a gate arpeggiator and turn it on, and then I can start noodling on the pad.
So I have your website up. I won't be able to have the volume for that, just because I didn't wire that up this time. But folks can see it's devhammer.net/music. It's got a bunch of recordings and stuff on there.
Yeah, and the DevHammer's Chaos song is just something that I started with a drum beat pattern, added in a simple bass loop and then just used the gate arpeggiator and was noodling over it. And one of the cool things that this does is you can set up a different scale. So it'll give you all kinds of different scales, everything from all of the various modes like Ionian, Lydian, Phrygian, all that good stuff. You can set up a blues scale. So the cool thing, you set up a blues scale and basically you can kind of noodle over anything and not ever hit a wrong note. You throw in a gate arpeggiator and you can end up with some just very interesting stuff. And it's, you're only going to do kind of more electronica kind of stuff with this. But it was really inexpensive. I think it was less than $150. The other cool thing is it's super portable, right? So I can throw a pair of headphones on this. I actually managed to keep my now 10-year-old entertained for the 4-hour drive from SharePoint Saturday down in Virginia Beach. We were driving on the way back, and he had the headphones on the whole time, just noodling around. So great little device.
I was trying to figure out here. So your voice was breaking up just a little, so it might be Skype here, or it could be the stream, but I guess we'll see. You could understand everything, but there was a bit of a slightly annoying little pop every so often here. I don't think it's anything on your end. So show us the other toy that you got quickly.
All right, so I'm going to just move my camera so you can see it, and
we can see that you're in fact wearing pants.
Yes, there's the new toy. I've got this hooked up to my my old Zune dock, but it's. Oops, and I need to turn that on. But, this is the Korg MicroStation. So this is a micro key. Let me see if I can kind of... a micro key synthesizer. Yeah, really. I just got the wrong... Here, we can kind of get the ant's eye view of the keys. So these are actually mini-size keys, so you can kind of see comparatively. But it's a 61 key synthesizer with sequencer, does 16-channel sequencer. One of the things I really like is this joystick. So the joystick really gives you kind of a more, I think, more natural way of bending notes. So like if you're playing like a guitar patch or something, it's very, it's very natural in terms of the feel of the notes versus a pitch bend wheel and a mod wheel. So this actually combines it into an XY joystick. It's got 4...
Some people hate those, but I've always liked it. Yeah.
It's got 4 real-time control knobs, which are switchable between... there's an arpeggiator built in, and so you can actually change parameters about the arpeggiator in real time. You can also change some of the synthesis stuff real time, which is really, really cool. And just to kind of give you an idea of some of the sounds that this thing has on board, let's see. Just play one of the demo songs so you can kind of hear what that sounds like. It's got a nice thump to it.
Skrillex in a box.
And this actually came out in, I think, 2011 or 2012. So it's not a brand new device, but it's just kind of fun.
Sounds really great.
Yeah.
Oh, you got to let it finish the build. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Exactly.
Wait for the drop.
All right. Let me get rid of my shaky cam here and see if we can avoid making anybody vomit.
Yeah, and so you definitely don't want to stop it halfway through the build. You got to release that, otherwise everybody's going to
get that kind of. Oh no! Got to let it build. But it's got a ton of really great sounds, and I actually ended up buying this from an outfit called Sweetwater Sound, because one of the things that they used as a selling point was you get an SD card with a really sweet Hammond B3 sound to it. Let's see if I can
I bought a lot of stuff through them, and kind of shout out to Tyler there at Sweetwater, who's done a really good job with helping me out with stuff. One of which was the Cloud Lifter preamp that I was using to fix the audio levels on my microphone and stuff. So lots of cool stuff there.
Okay, and now I seem to be missing. That's weird. I seem to be missing the SD card that has that sound on. I was going to demo it, but I can't find it.
No worries. So the interesting thing about the MicroStation is it's completely self-contained, right?
Yes.
All the music creation that you do, you can do straight inside that synthesizer.
Yeah,
so it's kind of
exactly.
the model that was introduced in the mid 80s when you started seeing workstations coming out. Right.
But it's a workstation that's tiny. I mean, the entire thing is, I want to say, less than 3 feet wide. It's less than a foot deep, and it weighs practically nothing. So they actually have a little backpack case you can throw this in and just throw it over your shoulders. The only thing that is weird is that given how portable it is, it doesn't run on batteries. So they've actually released a new synth that I was looking at very recently called the Korg Cross, and it actually is full size keys, 61 key, but it's very, very lightweight, and it runs on battery. So I was really tempted by that. But one of the things they did, one of the choices they made with the Korg Cross was went with the mod wheel and pitch bend wheel, which I thought I really want to try out the XY joystick. And there's just there were some things about the MicroStation that I wanted to have some features, because part of the reason that I got this was I want to kind of get my sons, who are both taking piano lessons, and like my oldest has been taking piano lessons for 5 years, and I want to kind of introduce him to ways of recording the things that he does. Because sometimes he'll hop on the piano and he'll just noodle some blues thing, and I really want him to have the ability to kind of capture that, whether it's as a sequenced idea or whether that's using something like the Zoom recorder,
right,
and just capturing that and being able to to kind of remember some of the musical ideas that he noodles on, rather than just kind of they're off in the ether and they're gone.
Yeah. So I'm looking at the Korg Cross right here on Sweetwater's site. I can see that has full-size keys, but like you said, separate pitch and mod wheel on top. Yep. Yeah.
But it's got great sounds. It also has the ability, you can actually record, if you plug in a microphone, I think you can actually record digital audio into the Korg Cross, so you can actually do some cool stuff around that. So it's definitely got some interesting features compared to the MicroStation. And the reality is that for me at least, since I'm not as deep on the synth, world as you are, it's almost one of the difficulties of purchasing a synth is, okay, in a given budget range, there are so many choices of really cool things.
Yeah.
And not just Korg, but Roland's got great stuff, Yamaha's got great stuff, and I mean, in terms of electronic music, it's a great time, to be into that and be playing with that, because so, I mean, like the MicroStation, is $399. When I bought my first synth, I've got an Alesis QS 6.1, which I bought probably 15 years ago or so. That was, I think, $700 or $800, and it's not nearly as feature packed as this is. To get something with this many features when I got my Alesis would have been probably $1,500, $2,000. So the amount of stuff that you get for a good price, even in hardware synths, is amazing. And then I've got a neighbor who works for music and arts, and of course he's got his own studio in the basement and whatnot, and he's constantly telling me, just go with software, you can get so much more. And he's right cost wise, but I sometimes I'll just like having knobs and stuff, what I mean? So and having it self-contained is pretty cool.
Let's talk a bit about that, because I do a mix of both software and hardware. Excuse me. You can see I have a bunch of hardware behind me. I also have controllers that add the knobs and stuff that you're missing on software, but I like them for different reasons. So I'll use software for things like really complex evolving pads and sounds like that, where they're based on samples and there's tons and tons of layers in there and lots of effects and things like that. And then I'll use the hardware here just for kind of massive analog sounds or certain sounds that I just can't seem to get from software. Like I You won't be able to hear this, Andrew, but everybody else will. But this, I'm going to open the filter on the modular for a second, but it's just like, let's see. I mean, you generally don't get a sound that alive and kind of that massive from software. So when I'm looking for that, I'll go with more hardware. But I also like what you're saying is, I think one of the really nice things about something portable like what you're messing with is it's portable. I mean, you can go and you can pick it up, you can take it somewhere. There's no laptop, there's no friction. You don't have to turn anything else on if you want to hear it. You just noodle away and you're good. Right.
Yeah, and I think about there was a time when my younger days I actually was part of a band, and I would drag my Alesis with me, and go out to rehearsal and gigs and stuff, and I had gig bag for it and everything. The sucker's heavy. I mean, it was probably 20-30 pounds, and so lugging that around, and I would also play guitar, so I had my keyboard amp, I had my guitar amp, I had my I had a Fender, actually I still have a Fender Strat, and my Alesis. That ends up being a lot of gear for one guy.
It is.
Whereas toting this thing around to a gig would be, a breeze. The only real downside for this is, in terms of playability, is it does have the micro-sized keys, and so if you're used to big keys or if you've got really fat fingers, it can be, a little harder.
So when I was at Decibel, there was a Q&A with one of the performers there, and he was up on stage and being interviewed by some guys from Ableton, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But he had brought up that he won't bring anything to a gig. He's a producer / DJ, right? But he also incorporates, live performance as part of that, like many do, where it's not just on software. But his thing is, if it doesn't fit in the backpack that he throws over his shoulder, then it doesn't go to the gig. So I was trying to figure out, because I've got a little synthesizer here, Dave Smith Tetra, right? Which is a neat little synth, but its lack of knobs for all the parameters drives me nuts sometimes. But this was brought up specifically as the example that this guy brings to the gigs, precisely because it's the size of a sandwich, right? He just throws it in the bag and he's good. I've eaten some sandwiches in my days. But it's actually, I've seen some phones about this size. Isn't there a Samsung phone that's about that size? Hey. Anyway, so size in those cases and weight and stuff factor in for different types of performances. Where if you go back to like the 70s and stuff, where a lot of the live performance acts would actually haul full modular synthesizers on stage, and these things were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds, and they had tons of roadies doing that. Actually, when I talked to Jordan, Jordan used to do that, right? Yeah, Jordan used to bring his modular on the road with him when he played for when he was playing for Dream Theater, and he eventually stopped doing that because he said he just felt so bad seeing the roadies like struggling under the weight of this massive thing.
Right, and for folks who might not be familiar, you're talking about Jordan Rudess, right?
Yeah, from Dream Theater, right, yeah. So what I'd like to do here is, especially for people who have no idea how to get started in this and kind of how music is created on computers and stuff these days, I just wanted to give a quick rundown of the different pieces involved, like we're dealing with like audio interfaces, typical software, what we call DAWs, digital audio workstations, a little bit on synthesizers, and then places where you can publish your music, right?
Right.
So if you think about music production today, there is an awful lot that's done what's called in the box, which is you bring your laptop somewhere, it has an audio interface, right? And you make all the music directly inside there with soft synths and samples and everything, and you might have a small controller that's attached to it.
Right.
You can do an amazing amount of stuff with that, right? In fact, I would never buy a hardware sampler these days because sampling on a computer is so much easier, and editing the waveforms and stuff is so much better than what a small screen on a sampler can do.
Yeah.
with the exception of things like the Akai ones where, it's more pad based as opposed to, trying to figure out how to create a sample and loop it and all that stuff, right?
Well, so one of the things I would say in terms of the kind of pure PC versus separate hardware setup is for beginners. The advantage of pure PC is that it's really cheap to get started, right? Mm-hmm. You can get, kind of cut down versions of whether it's, whether it's Sonar, whether it's Cubase, whether it's Ableton. I mean, there are either free or really inexpensive versions of almost all of the major, DAW software packages. Right. And you can get, really good patches for cheap or free. So kind of getting started is really easy. Some of it though, one of the things that's really tough for beginners is sort of getting everything right in terms of the setup. It used to be a lot harder. It's easier now. But maybe you can speak to sort of getting kind of getting things set up so that it actually really sounds good.
Sure. So I start with the software for a second here. Because you had mentioned Ableton and some other pieces. So I have up here the website for Ableton Live. And this is, for performance, is probably the top producer / DJ performance app out there, right? Whenever I see live acts, they almost always have Ableton Live running on their machine.
Right.
And Andrew, can you tilt your camera down just a little? Because now you're just
I can.
You're like Kilroy.
I'm just...
There you go.
Like Kilroy?
Okay.
Okay.
So Ableton is one. Clearly, I've also been working a lot with ImageLine, who create FL Studio. And it's really interesting to think... So FL Studio is one of those ones that you might think is a bit of a toy. But in fact, it's according to some sources, the single most popular digital audio workstation out there. And then finally, the other one I want to bring up is Cubase, which is one that I use. And this is, actually I use all three, but Cubase is the one I have the most experience in. And this is more for people who want to do stuff with MIDI and external instruments and scoring and stuff like that.
Right.
So each of these pieces of software has advantages and disadvantages based upon the type of music you want to create, the type of performance that you want to have.
Right.
But in general, they all do a couple of things. They allow you to record music, whether it's recorded as note information from MIDI, musical instrument digital interface, like stuff that synthesizers and keyboard controllers communicate with, or you're recording just the straight audio, right? So they let you record that. The next thing that you can do with those is add effects to tracks. So you can take the audio that you have, and they'll have things like reverb and delay and chorus effects and some really wild effects. And the effects technology has come a long way. Like some of these are really, really good effects, right? The other thing that they let you do is mix all the stuff together, right? So they have built-in mixers. You could, let's say you have 16 tracks of audio and stuff. You can apply effects to it. You can mix it, and then you can render it all down to some sort of an audio file.
Right.
Now, the piece of software that you choose, again, is going to depend a lot on the types of things that you want to do. But I generally encourage people to consider either Ableton, FL Studio, or Cubase. One of those. I mean, there's Cakewalk, and there's Sonar, and there's a bunch of other stuff too. But I generally these ones are the ones that are leading.
Now let's. So one of the things that. So, kind of harking back to the MicroStation. So the MicroStation, it takes on some of the aspects of a digital audio workstation in that it can do the sequencing. So I can build up, via the MIDI sequencer, 16 tracks worth of stuff. But one of the things that a PC-based DAW will do that the MicroStation won't is allow you to record actual audio. And or grab, for example, audio loops and use those. So one popular way of building up songs is to take existing, for example, drum loops and bring those into a DAW and just kind of copy and paste and build the sections of the song that you want that way, which is really, really helpful if you're a musician who doesn't play drums, right? And so you need a good rhythm loop. You can go grab a good for on the floor, or a disco track if you want to do kind of go retro modern, and build that up kind of loop by loop, and then do some performing over top of that. And one of the one of the cool things is when you have software, you talked about portability. One of the toys that I've got that this is a fun toy. This is the Akai MPK Mini. Yep. So this actually is a USB mini keyboard. This will easily fit in a backpack. It's very lightweight, one cable, and it's plugged in. And they have templates that you can basically set this up in software for Ableton, for any of the major DAW software, including we've got 8 pads, so you could set up samples or loops on the pads. It's got real-time knobs. So this is exactly the kind of thing that takes you the next step beyond, okay, I've got this software on my PC, I don't have any hardware. With one cable, now I've got the ability to do real-time performance and control, and bring up some of the loops and patches and things that, so I can build my backing parts of my song through the pads, and then, noodle over top of that with my lead or whatever other sound I might like.
So I've got something similar to that I've started bringing with me when I travel to campus, because if I'm not doing an event when I'm up there, I find that my evenings are generally free. But if I am doing an event, I'm preparing talks and everything when I get back to the hotel. But it's much more fun to be able to sit down and noodle around a bit instead of just like wasting time watching TV or some such crap. Right. So I do a similar thing with, I've got my controller keyboard in the background here. That's what I use to control some of the MIDI synths that are rack synths, as well as the software that I have. Now the second piece, you have a controller. Which is optional, but highly recommended. I mean, you can get them as cheap as like $40 if you want one of the little the little Korg jobs, right? The second thing that you probably want to consider is an audio interface, right? So the sound card that's built into most computers, whether it be PC, Mac, anything like that, is not up to the task of doing all this real-time audio. So you get a lot of what's called latency. And latency is the amount of time between when you cause something to happen and when it actually happens. So think about like you press a key down on the keyboard, right? And then you want to hear the sound, right? On something where you're just using built-in audio cards, you will usually get an audible amount of latency. It might be 100 milliseconds or it might be even more, which is, anything over 50 milliseconds or 30, depending upon the how young you are and how good your hearing is audible. Right. So what's usually recommended is that you get some sort of an external audio interface. And I've got on my setup over here, I've got a Motu 828 Mark III, which is both audio and a MIDI interface. And then for my travel bag, I have a really small Focusrite. It's like 2i2 or something like that I bring with me, which is just like one audio out and 2 audio in or something like that. Yeah. And these are, it's sort of like gaming on a PC. You're not going to play hardcore games on the integrated video that's built into like an Intel chip, right? You could do a certain amount of work, but you're not getting the amount of acceleration that's required for some of the hardcore games. When you're dealing with this is kind of hardcore audio. This is not just listening to videos on YouTube. This is doing real-time generation of sounds, real-time signal processing, effects, and all that stuff. So you're going to need a piece of gear to handle that. Now, go ahead.
One of the things that I find really interesting about the direction, particularly compared to gaming, right? The direction that things have gone with audio. I can recall back in the day when what you would get is you would get some monster PCI sound card, slap that in, and then you'd usually have a hard drive base size piece of equipment that tied to the sound card, and that's where you would do all your plugging in and unplugging of your gear. Seems like the direction the audio interfaces is going is definitely external USB rather than internal pieces. I think in part for portability, but also just because trying to keep up with the different ways that you plug cards into PCs is, is not great. Whereas with gaming, it seems like internal is generally there are very few, if any, decent external video cards. Most of that is for, just, ease of plugging things in, not for performance.
Right. So I think Thunderbolt is something that promises to change that a bit, at least for video, but it's kind of to be determined. The really hardcore audio interfaces are still PCI, right? So those are the ones where you run a studio and you need to have like lots and lots of inputs and stuff like that. But almost all the consumer ones are either USB or FireWire. And the reason is, like you said, it's portability, but also just the fact that most people these days use laptops. When I travel, I use a laptop. I love my desktop at my house, but the majority of people, and I don't have any real numbers to support this, but the majority of people are running off laptops these days. Right. When's the last time you went into the store and you saw a section of a bunch of desktops? I mean, it's just unusual to see that at this point. Right.
Well, and
so you're going to get one of those. Oh, go ahead.
Well, even for desktop purposes, I mean, increasingly, the form factors for desktops even are kind of shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. I mean, I was at the office the other day, and they have, all the reception desks have these new Lenovo all-in-one devices with, it's like a 24-inch monitor, beautiful monitors, and the base of the monitor is roughly the size of a laptop, and that's the PC. And I was like, of course, I immediately got gadget lust. I'm like, oh, I want one of those. Yeah. But I've also looked at the Intel new unit of computing boxes, because they're about, yay big, and you can get a Core i7 in this, maybe 5x5 little by, inch and a half tall box. And that's the kind of thing where, no, you're never going to get a great audio interface inside that box, but USB, you can add something, and then you've got something that's as portable as a laptop, and all you need is another monitor. Get yourself a little Pico projector, and you got a desktop in a bag.
Yeah. So I want to be clear, just like going back to the analogy with games, you can do audio work on your desktop or your laptop or whatever machine without these. You'll just have to understand that it's not going to be as fast or allow you to do as many things as having an external interface. So if you're just getting started, you can start with a very inexpensive piece of software, optionally spend some money on some sort of a little keyboard controller interface, and then save the audio interface purchase for sort of like your next round once you feel like, hey, this is something that I enjoy doing, right?
And so, apart from the cost of the PC itself, people could get started for probably under $200, even with an external controller, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really inexpensive. I forget what the least expensive version of FL Studio is, but it's really cheap, and it's like lifetime free upgrades. And then there are there are products like Reaper, and then there are even some relatively inexpensive free DAWs. But I would encourage you to, when you're looking at one of these pieces of software, go on YouTube or other sites, and if you're the kind of person that likes to watch a tutorial, see how much support there is before you go and invest in one of these. Because learning a DAW is like learning an IDE for programming. It's like once you invest in that, it's an investment, and then changing from one to the other is a non-trivial experience.
Yeah, and that's the other thing I would definitely say about the software end of things is one of the reasons that I wanted to get the MicroStation in terms of the hardware is that there are times when working with a particular hardware synth is a whole lot more accessible. In some of the, I mean, like I've used Sonar, I've used Cubase, and just for a raw beginner trying to figure out how to choose a patch for a given channel and then get that to work with your external controller can result in a little bit of hair pulling. And once you've kind of gotten over that learning curve, it can be a whole lot of fun and a lot more flexible. But that initial learning curve, I've spent some time beating my head against the desk trying to figure some of those things out.
I mean, if you're like a synthesizer playing or something like that, I've recorded directly into Audacity, like from the Korgs and stuff. Right. I've recorded directly into Audacity in that without having to go through another piece of software, just because if I'm doing something just on that I don't want audio, I don't want effects, I don't want any like editing capabilities, I'll put it in that, and then it's, you know, the least amount of friction to doing something. No project setup, nothing else, right?
Right.
So the other thing that I wanted to make sure that we covered here is a bit about these external synthesizers and I don't know what the differences are between them, and you know, what some people may perceive as better or worse than other ones, etc. So recently there's been a bit of a resurgence in analog synthesizers. So back in the late 80s and early 90s, I worked in a music store, and it was really funny because at that time, everybody was trading in their analog synthesizers for the new digital ones, and they were just getting pennies on the dollar for their, you know, great like Jupiter 8s and like massive synths that go for, you know, $15,000 now, because they wanted things like the D50 and the new Workstations and a bunch of other stuff like that. So it's interesting to see that come back around, and companies like Moog, so I'll pull up their website here. Moog, who quite literally invented the analog synthesizer. I mean, there's Bootcloud on the West Coast that did some different things, but Moog invented I would say the first musical one that you could actually play like a real instrument. They have been doing a lot of work in the analog area. I don't know if we can see it on camera here. Let's see. I've got, yeah, you could barely see it, but here's a... I've got a little Moog Sub Phatty behind me, which has just such a massive sound. It's got a great sound. It's a 100% analog signal path synthesizer, which we'll cover the differences there in just a second. There's also a resurgence in modular synthesis, where let me pull just this up for a second so you can see it a little better. There are more than a handful of companies making modular synthesizers in both what's called MU or 5U, so either Moog unit or 5 rack units high, as well as what's called Euro rack, which is much smaller and it's really great. Has tons and tons and tons of modules, but isn't quite so interesting as this to me anyway. So there's a lot of resurgence in those types of synthesizer development. It's one of those cyclical things where we went all digital, and now we're sort of going all analog again, and then, you know, we'll go all digital again later, I'm sure.
So take a step back for a second and explain a little bit about what a modular synth is. Yeah. So for people who don't know anything about synthesis, what is the advantage of having a modular synth?
Let me pull this up for a second here. Let's see. Hold on one second. Hey, there we go. All right. So synthesizers are all generally made of the same blocks of processing, whether that's analog or digital. And I'm talking about subtractive synthesis, which is the most common right now, not talking about sampling or FM or some of the other ones. You can learn lots of stuff about those elsewhere. But most of them they have a sound source, which is typically called an oscillator. Right, and that sound source then feeds audio into a filter, and that filter, its job in subtractive synthesis is to cut down the harmonics of a sound, right? And then there's kind of shaping over time, which are envelopes, right? So you can have envelopes on the filter, you can have envelopes on the overall audio as well, through what's called the VCA, the voltage controlled amplifier. But you get all those parts that are the typical synthesizer for subtractive synthesis. If you go and buy, you know, any sort of synthesizer that has a keyboard attached and some knobs on it and says it's analog, it's going to basically follow this path. Okay. Modular synthesizers have each of these components as discrete modules in the rack, right? So let me pull this up. But if I'm looking here, I've got 4 oscillators, right? And then I've got 2 envelope generators, I've got 2 amplifiers, I've got a transistor ladder filter, I've got another type of filter. And what a modular synthesizer makes possible is I could patch these in different ways to experiment with things other than the traditional, oscillator filter VCA type approach that you typically see in hardwired synthesizers. Not only that, if I want a really enormous sound, I can have multiple oscillators. So like that sound from earlier, and let me do it again because I just love to. Let's see. So that's 3 oscillators being modulated by what's called an LFO. But because nothing is hardwired, I can modulate all sorts of different things. Modulating means like changing them over time by anything else, right? So it just gives me that freedom to be able to experiment with the way sounds are created.
Now, when you have, whether it be an oscillator or an LFO, one of the things that, as I understand it, makes a huge difference in terms of the sound quality is what waveform you're using for a given oscillator. So can you talk a little bit about the different waveforms and what kind of sound you get from them?
So this is, waveforms are defined by the kind of the harmonics that they're made up of. So let me see if I can, let me turn this up for just a second here. Up, down. So right now I've got one oscillator. Just a little. One oscillator. It's using a pulse. Change that to a ramp. A little different. A sawtooth. Also a little different here. Triangle will be smoother. And then the sine wave will be kind of the smoothest because the sine wave has the fewest harmonics.
Right.
Right. Now I can also change the pitch range. Right. And then you can do things like you can modulate the pulse width over time. So let's see. That out.
So you've got all these different things in your modular synth. Now, I know one of the projects you did a while back is you actually wrote a software synthesizer using a technology that shall not be named.
Oh, poor Silverlight.
So what was the experience for you of building that? I mean, did you take any existing code that was generating the waveforms, or did you write that kind of by hand? Because presumably what you've got to do is you've got to generate all those waveforms and then use software to simulate the oscillators, right?
Right. And so at the time, I did, because this was the first time I wrote any kind of real synthesizer, I just used math to calculate the waveforms. So, I mean, you can use sine, calculate sine in real time. You can also use lookup tables for performance reasons and stuff. And what that ends up creating are the cleanest possible representations of those sounds. So one thing that stuff like analog synthesizers give you, and quite honestly, a lot of the digital emulations of analog synthesizers, there are a lot of extra strange harmonics that get thrown in. So for example, a square wave won't be exactly square. It's not a 1-0-1-0-1 type thing. It might have a little bit of a peak and sort of slant down very slightly, like they do on the Moog. Something like a sawtooth, which is the one that's looks like a triangle that's sort of right triangle.
Right.
It may have additional harmonics both at the top and the bottom of that. Right. So it's one of those things that the imperfections of analog synthesis add all these additional harmonics and additional things to sound that are generally considered to be the character of the sound.
Right.
Right.
Yep, that's exactly the word I was thinking of.
Yeah. So let me pull this up for a second. There are a couple of different types of synthesis here that I think are worth covering. So what you heard with the modular, as well as the Moog, and also my Korg there behind me, is 100% pure analog synthesis, where they are voltage controlled oscillators. And what a voltage controlled oscillator is an oscillator that the pitch that you're trying to get out of it is determined based upon the voltage going into it. And so Korg and some of the old, I think Roland actually, synthesizers used volts per hertz, I think it is. So if you think about audio, it can be measured in hertz, right? And which is a logarithmic curve, right? The other one, which kind of ended up winning in the end, is volts per octave, so that you know that each octave can be represented by 1 volt. So if you divide an octave as 12 notes, divide that evenly in 12, and each one of those is a step of 1/12 of a volt, right? So when you want to, let's say, control an analog synthesizer, the key that you press, either directly through electronics or indirectly through software, is mapped to that voltage range. Now, there's another kind of synthesis, which some people don't consider analog, but it really is, which is a digitally controlled oscillator. So instead of being mapped directly to voltage, it is still an analog circuit, but the pitch is determined by a clock signal that's applied to it, right? So a microprocessor generates a clock signal, which is a number of pulses, and the number of pulses over time determines the pitch, right? So it's really just a clock signal. So in the little diagram here, you can see, in order to raise the pitch on a VCO, you raise the voltage. In order to raise the pitch on a DCO, you increase the clock rate, right? So it's very kind of interesting approach there. Both of those are analog, right? So this one that I brought up before, the Tetra, this uses DCOs. Now, the advantage of something like this is the pitch doesn't drift over time. It's much more stable. Whereas on a voltage-controlled synthesizer, especially the really old ones, the pitch will drift over time. So the modular synth here needs to be on an hour before you play it. The same thing with the Moog Sub Phatty behind me. So if you were going to perform with this live or do a recording or something, you need to let that temperature stabilize before you start playing it. Otherwise, the pitch is going to be drifting in and out of tune while you're playing.
So that's based on the temperature of the circuits, not necessarily on degradation of the power supply, or does the power supply
can have an effect on it? You know, of course. It's like you would never want to use a switching power supply, which you can hear here. People can probably hear that. That is me just holding a switching power supply close to the microphone input. And that's just the power supply for my laptop. So definitely the power supply has an effect on it. The temperature has an effect on it. You know, it's sort of old modular synthesizers especially. You would never know if the patch is going to sound the same way twice. And again, that's what sort of adds to the character of it, and the drifting of the oscillators actually adds to the width of the sound. So when things get slightly detuned, it sounds massive to your ears. Where if things are perfectly in tune, it generally sounds kind of thin, right?
Well, and like a lot of the synthesizers will include, you know, even the software synthesizers include, you know, some tweaking that you can just add some digital noise into the circuit. So that's,
you can add digital noise, you can simulate drift and stuff. They still don't seem to quite have the analog presence. In theory, it's entirely possible to do so. I mean, the sampling rates, quite honestly, are high enough that those harmonics can be very easily filtered out. But the presence still doesn't seem to be there, and whether or not that's some sort of just bias on the part of the listener versus you know, true difference between the two. Like if you did an A/B, could you really tell in many cases? Hard to say.
You need the blind taste test.
Exactly. So the other kind of synthesizer, we talked about software, computer software. So that's, you know, quite obviously you're writing code that's creating the sound, it's doing the filters, everything else. And then very similarly is stuff like this. This is a Blofeld. You have to say that with a German accent.
Did you just get that?
No, I've had this for a little bit. It's not my favorite sounding synth, quite honestly. So that's why it's not patched in right at the moment. The Blofeld, instead of having analog circuitry inside it, is 100% DSP. So by DSP, these are digital signal processing chips. These are chips that are dedicated to processing audio, right? And what you can do is you can write all the code on those, typically in assembly, to to simulate the types of, or to create the types of sounds that you want. So they're not limited by the types of things that analog synthesizers are. They're typically limited only by the amount of memory and the amount of processing power. More processing power you add, the more capable they are. So very cool. One of my favorite ones that's DSP based, which is hooked up, is a small Axis virus. And Axis virus has some incredible pads in it, right? Which is an interesting thing to point out. The Korg behind me, the Moog behind me, and unless I get some special circuitry to kind of round robin the oscillators, are all monophonic, meaning they play one note at a time. Whereas digital synthesizers can play 64 notes at a time or 32 notes at a time.
You're just limited by processing power at that point.
And it may sound like, well, I don't have more than 10 fingers. Why do I need all these notes? Even with foot pedals, that's only, like 12, right?
Yeah, but when you're sequencing...
Exactly. So if you want to record multiple tracks of this and not have to bounce them down to audio, having more processing power there means more tracks.
Yeah, exactly.
So the kind of the final thing I wanted to do here as we're wrapping up is talk about how to share. So let me see here. Get to this. Oh, let me show that. So synthesizers.com here. Let me show. This is a modular synthesizer of fairly decent size. Mine is not that big. But this is a current manufacturer of these, and you can buy them a module at a time. They even have a purchasing thing where you can start off and over the course of a year build your modular synth and whatnot, and really, really fun. Right. The final thing here is sharing your audio. So you make some cool recordings, and in the old days when you and I were growing up, that meant you had to go and bounce it down to tape and like start handing it out on the sidewalk and after concerts, and
you have your little 4-track cassette tape and and good stuff.
And that just that may have seemed fun, but it didn't scale that well. These days, there are a number of sites for for publishing your audio. So I tend to use SoundCloud. I've always been really happy with what they provide for support here. And I have a pro account with them, which means that I can put tons of stuff on there. And it's as simple as I use my DAW, or in the case of two things that I did last night, I just use Audacity, and then I go and bounce that down to a WAV file, and then upload it to SoundCloud. Right. There are other sites. There's YouTube, of course. I've recorded some things and put up some videos, but the effort there is much higher because I try to create a video that works with the audio and that's significantly higher investment on that. There are sites like Bandcamp. I know a lot of people use like Bandcamp, and believe it or not, kind of blast from the past, MySpace, right? So I don't have a MySpace account. I've never had a MySpace account. But if you haven't been there in a while, it no longer looks like the weird kind of barf on the inside of a locker in high school that it used to look like. It's starting to really turn into much more of a professional music site where you have a band, you want to publish the music, and then you publish it on something like that. And there are hundreds of places you can share your stuff.
Yeah, and it's interesting that to see that site having almost completely died away, morph into something that it's not necessarily uber social media, kind of covering the full spectrum of social media. It's really focused on music. Another interesting thing I actually ran into just the other day is for people who maybe want to play around with a DAW without kind of investing in installing software or whatever else. There's actually a site called SoundStation, soundstation.com. And it's based on, it uses a Flash plugin, which is not my favorite thing in the world, but it's a really cool idea in that you've got essentially a semi-full featured DAW in the browser. And so they've got soft synths that you can select. You can, build up multiple tracks of audio, and then they've also got the ability to save that audio and share it with other people. It's really kind of it I think lowers the barrier of entry quite a bit in terms of just kind of getting your feet wet with a DAW and seeing if that's the kind of thing that is appealing to you.
I will say being in the browser doesn't give you that same immersive kind of in the moment feeling, right?
Sure.
Especially clicking around stuff on the mouse, but it does let
Yeah.
you experiment a bit and see what it's all about, which I think is a really great idea.
And I haven't had a chance to work with it enough to know if they support anything like actually MIDI input from, I would imagine that you'd probably run into issues with latency even if they support that. What I played around with a little bit was, just basic piano roll style input. And that's just where, you see kind of a grid, much like you would in a looping software package or something like that, where you just, click on the notes that you want to play in the order that you want to play them, and you can drag them around and, resize the length and things like that. But it was really easy to get a basic bass loop going. And I imagine, building out a rhythm track would be really easy too. So, kind of, there's a lot of cool possibilities that don't cost a lot to play with.
Right. And so you mentioned the piano roll type, environment. I just pulled up a screenshot here of FL Studio Groove, which is something that I worked with ImageLine to bring to the Windows Store, but it's very much like that. And I think right now it's like $11.99 in the store. So this is another thing that if you have a Windows 8 PC or a Surface or anything like that, for $11.99, you can get in there and start noodling around and making music. And then there are very similar things for iPad. Same thing where you can get in there and start making music. And if that's interesting to you, some of them let you export, the MIDI stuff. Some of them let you export audio. But in all cases, you can somehow bring it into, a more of a full-fledged DAW. Right. Yeah,
and Touch is a really fun way of playing around with stuff like this, particularly loop-based synthesis. Touch just kind of adds a layer of fun, and there are some things that the precision of a mouse and a keyboard is better for. So one of the things I like about FL Studio Groove is I can slap that on my my Carbon X1 Touch, and when I want to fiddle around with Touch, I can very easily do that. But when I want some precision, then I can just use the trackpad and so for like cutting and pasting and lengthening notes, mouse and keyboard's a little easier for that. But for the basic performance stuff, Touch is just feels more natural sometimes to have that direct interaction.
Yep. And in fact, the little kind of ditty that we use here to open and close the show, you had put together quite quickly on FL Studio Groove like one time. And I stole it from you and started using it from the show.
Which is totally fine. I don't mind. It's really simple. It's not like it's anything special, but it was just a very quick loop. Yeah. A little bit of rhythm, a little bit of bass line, and then just some hits. One of these days I'll probably elaborate on that or do something new. But
maybe I can get my filter sweep as our new sound, and just like whoa, and that'll be it, right? I didn't show people what my shirt was today, so it's let's see.
That is perfect for today. That's absolutely perfect.
That's my. I was wearing that to what was the amusement park I went to with the kids? It was King's Dominion, I think it was, and they have a whole Peanuts section. There was a theme, and this kid that was working in the restaurant there, he stopped me. It embarrassingly stopped me in the middle of the restaurant. He went, wait. He's looking at me like, wait. I was like, what? It's like, is my food poisoned? Is there a big cat turd on my chicken? What is going on? And he goes, where did you get that shirt? I was like,
Daft
fine.
Peanuts.
Yes. All right, man. So any closing words for today?
So just for the folks who are listening live or the folks who are watching this show, this will not be the last thing we do on Synthesis. Both Pete and I also are very big fans of sort of the handmade music movement. Yes. Pete, I know you've got a ton of kit synths. I only have a few of my own, of course, as usual. Your geekiness sometimes exceeds my own. But I think we're probably going to do a future show on actually synthesizer kits and, kind of building stuff out by hand. That can be both a fun way of indulging your maker side. If you like to sling a soldering iron, sometimes putting these things together can be a whole lot of fun. But it also can be an inexpensive way of getting some really interesting sounds for your kit.
This is in progress.
Wow, that one's big.
Now I'm dropping stuff all over them.
What is that one?
This is a Zox box, which is a TB303, an old Roland clone. And this is kind of an enhanced one from third party.
Very cool.
And it's not even close to being done. Don't fall over. There we go.
Don't break stuff. Don't break stuff.
I have everything like kind of piled up at there just because of the re-cleaning my office yesterday.
Right.
Somehow, after cleaning my office, half the stuff is homeless. I'm just looking at like piles of cables and just piles of crap everywhere. So anyway, great. Well, thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you.
And I think this is probably it for today.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for watching.